Hi, John.
Hi.
Hello. I can hear you now too. All right. So this is John Allspaw, and he's going to be talking about incident analysis, how learning is different than fixing. And I'm super excited for it. So I'll let you introduce yourself and kick it off.
All right. Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. My name is John Allspaw. I've spent most of my career trying to understand how engineers solve problems. Whether or not I can help with it is a different story. I don't have much time in this talk, so I don't want to spend too much talking about myself. So here's the main sort of gist, the sort of high level points that I want to get across. The first is I'm going to assert that current and typical sort of conventional approaches to learning from incidents have very little to do with actual learning. From the title, you can understand that my opinion is that learning is not the same as fixing, and I will talk a little bit about that and what I mean by that. I'd also assert that most post-incident review documents are documents that are written to be more often filed, not written to be read. That has maybe some obvious or not so obvious implications on what's learned from them. I would also say that that changing the primary focus from fixing to learning will result in a significant competitive advantage. Now, it's going to be quite difficult to sort of make a switch, but let's see what I mean by fixing and learning and see what you think. We can talk about it later in Q&A. So when as engineers we're somewhat hardwired to some extent. Our core rationale for being is to fix things, is to build things, is to adjust things, that sort of thing. I'm going to say that when you focus on fixing things, they tend to get fixed pretty quickly, and that is sort of expected, right? But I would also say this, is that the quality and effectiveness of this fixing and otherwise preventing future issues is going to be proportional or certainly influenced on how well you understand how the thing works to begin with. And this is a real distinction. Again, the point that I'll keep sort of trying to hammer home is if your goal is to fix, you're going to fix something. Whether or not it was the right thing to fix, or fixing it in the way that that is possible, even if you were to take a step back a little bit to get a broader understanding, is really up in the air. Another way of saying this is that attention paid to learning will always yield higher quality fixing. That I feel very confident about. If instead, on the flip side, you focus exclusively on fixing, that can be a barrier for learning, because you've as soon as you have presented a plausible way to fix something, then it tends to shut down under sort of time and production pressure, shut down any other options. So I want to take a look at sort of the conventional view on where post-incident analysis, how it usually goes. There's an incident and or some time happens. Maybe somebody will do some work to make a timeline. This is usually, at least typically conventionally, where the industry believes the work happens, which is this meeting. By the way, it's a very expensive meeting. The burden on this meeting to sort of solve all of the problems so that it never happens again is very, very large. Maybe somebody will write a report. Hopefully somebody will write something up, because there are people who will be in positions where they weren't there at the incident, they weren't at the meeting. But there's a tendency to think that the only your greatest value is here on these action items. Now, if the action items are the only goal you've got, then I would go out on a limb and say that you're missing out on a significant amount of what you could be getting out of the incident. So learning, let's talk about learning for just a minute here. I would say that learning is happening all of the time. It's a core part of being human, not just engineers. The thing that I would say is there's no real distinction. There's no crisp line of that people are not learning. Oh, we're not learning from incidents, or we're learning from incidents. The fact is that learning's happening. The question isn't whether learning is happening. It is. The question is, what is learned? Who is learning? When are they learning? How they learn? All of these depend on how well practices are set up to support it. If there are conditions set up by peers and technology and leadership and all sorts of the business support that makes it a priority to learn from incidents, then it's possible. If it's not, then it's not. This might be reasonably obvious, but I think definitely in the modern complex software applications, no one can understand everything about everything. No single person can do this. We should be surprised, given this, that things work as well as they do. Now, you think about this for just a moment. No one has an objectively comprehensive understanding of how everything is supposed to work. They collectively, with their peers, recalibrate how they understand things work. Incidents are a big part of that. And it's still not comprehensive. The fact is that they know enough about it to make it work as well as it does. Finally, I would just throw here that the frequency of incidents has really nothing to do with how well an organization learns, right? It might be a signal of something, but if the number of incidents or the rate of incidents is going up, that is not evidence that the organization is not learning. If it's going down, that is not evidence that the organization is learning. A conventional myth is that we have an incident and we'll think of it as, and these canonical set of lessons can then sort of extracted, like a concentrated, right, from this incident. That's the whole point, right? Which is then sort of shared or sort of transmitted to a group. When we have this idea, which is, here's this incident, oh, here they are, these beautiful, delicious lessons, they're concentrated, so, be careful, now consume them. When we have this perspective, the perceived problem to be solved then is how to somehow share better. It must not be because of the lessons, but because of the sharing. Now, I'd say that sharing is a little bit funky here, right? Because in some contexts, if I were to share something with you and you did take it or didn't even know it was there, did I share it really? Or did really I just make it available to you? That's a digression. The reality is that different people will always have varying understandings. They'll have different perspectives before and after an incident. And what questions or mysteries remain for them can't be captured in some sort of one size fits all that goes to sort of the masses. If I tell you something that you already knew, did you learn it? Did you learn it from that lesson? I'm not entirely sure that's true. What is important or notable or interesting to somebody will differ from person to person and can also be valuable to each of those people. You can know something that your peers knew and you still learned that. This turns out what's important or notable or interesting is what actually remembered. Now, this might be somewhat controversial, but I'm going to say this, that if you can't remember something, you can't say that you've learned it. I feel very strongly about this since my kids have been home learning. If I asked you, and we do, my organization, when we talk to teams, when we talk to engineers, we always ask them about incidents. We say, can you tell us about an incident that was significant? Tell us a story about an incident. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, I think in the hundreds of times we've asked that, there's not one engineer who has failed to come up with a story. And here's the thing, they're amazing. Not one story did I ever think, yeah, that's okay, that's fine. They were all amazing. When we ask people about incidents, a couple of things are common. One is they become very animated when they tell the story. Oh yeah, listen to this. Let me tell you, here's this one. Well, I can tell you about this one story. Yeah, let's tell you about this one story. They also tend to include some sort of elements of suspense in how they say it, right? Even engineers that wouldn't describe themselves as storytellers absolutely put a lot of effort, whether they know it or not, into how they tell it. That's what makes for the story. They include elements of surprise, like, for example, what we didn't know. So we went to, fire up Memcache, but what we didn't know at the time was they'll also give us some sort of backstory, right? So while this was going on, remember, we were streaming the Super Bowl and this is what was happening. Or remember, we were 2 hours away from our company IPOing. This was what was happening. They recall it most amazingly in ridiculous, really fine detail, even if it's many years since. And all of this fits with what we know about learning from incidents from other domains. Stories that people remember have elements of challenge, struggle, and difficulty. So therefore, if you want to broaden and deepen the understanding of how things work that surround an incident in your organization, you should consider doing that. One way of saying this is that interesting incident analysis documents, let's set aside the meeting. Interesting documents get read, compelling incidents get read, and they get shared with others. You know you're on the right track when engineers say, listen to their colleague, you gotta read this. I don't care what you're doing. Just if you're not deploying to prod, and when you're done deploying to prod, you gotta read this. Check this out. Fascinating documents get read, they get shared with others, commented on, asked about. They get referenced in code comments and in pull requests. You'll see them referenced in architecture diagrams. In other incidents, we'll refer to them. We've seen it. We've seen compelling write-ups, so demonstrative, so illustrative of what's happening in the software and in the organization, is in that it's been included in new hire onboarding. Here's what's important, is that uninteresting documents don't, any of it. Some of you may have seen or heard of a movie called Green Lantern. The point I want to make here is that just because something's made available to open and everywhere doesn't mean it's any good. The reason why nobody went to go see Green Lantern is because it's terrible. Incident write-ups are the same. So make an effort to highlight the messy details. The messy details are what makes people want to read, want to ask more questions. What was difficult for people to understand during the incident? What was surprising for people about the incident? How do people understand the origins of the incident? What mysteries still remain for people? There are mysteries that always remain. Nobody has a comprehensive, objectively true, universally understood understanding of how an incident came to be and how it took place and what to do about it later. I want to know what was difficult about an incident, and I want to be able to ask questions about that. This is something that all engineers could consider internalizing. One point that I'd like to throw out, which is because it's quite typical, is that you only pay attention or pay deliberate effort to understanding incidents that have high severity or high customer impact. But here's the thing, customer impact is not equivalent to the difficulty of solving the issue. They're orthogonal. Second point is that multiple difficulties can exist in the same incident. And fielding questions about what was or still is difficult that's the gold. That is the critical, that is how lasting memories are formed. And that is how people who weren't there and weren't at a meeting all sort of maintain throughout time. So multiple people have multiple stories. We talk a lot about mental models, but mental models are really stories. They're not pictures. There's an understanding, and people can quite often feel as though, until an incident happens, be pretty confident that how it works is how I think it works is how it works. What incidents do is allow us to take what we have in our mind and superimpose it and sort of contrast with others. And a great deal of it overlaps with what other people think about how it works. It has to overlap, otherwise it wouldn't work to begin with. But when we can contrast this, and what we can do is use incidents to allow, oh, wait a minute. So I thought it was like this, but it didn't. It looked like there's this other little thing that I missed. Or here are these things that I knew, but my colleagues didn't know this. And I thought they knew. And because I thought they knew, it never occurred to me to say what I know about this thing. This is using this opportunity for actual learning. So, what are some fine goals for a post-incident meeting? When participants in a group meeting, this big, expensive meeting, when they leave the meeting knowing new things they didn't know when they entered, and new things they didn't know about what their colleagues know about the incident, things are going well. Ideally, they'll also have an understanding of how to continue discussions and where to capture it. If you think about it for a minute, if the default is you've got an hour or 2 hours or some common regular cadence for how post-mortem or post-incident or after action or learning review, whatever you would like to call them, what these meetings are, it seems strange to spend the same amount of time in every incident, despite the fact that the incidents can vary in so many different directions. So continuing discussions and where it's all captured is significantly important. The same thing happens for a write-up. When you're done reading a write-up, if you know things now that you didn't know when you started, and you know things that you didn't know about what your colleagues know, and how to continue discussions and where to capture it. This is what makes a post-incident review write-up something worth reading. It's something worth sharing, and something that could be valuable to people in the future, because you're not writing it for now. You're writing it for people who will want to read it and need to read it in the future. So here are some things to experiment with. Separate the generation of follow-up action items from a group meeting, right? Instead of having the whole goal of that meeting where people are rushing to get follow-up items, separate it. Make that meeting about understanding. Record in the document who responded to the incident and who attended the group meeting. This is supporting your reader. Capture things that were done after the incident but before the group meeting in the document. Give write-ups to brand new engineers and ask them to record any and all questions after having read it. Link, this is an easy one, link jargon terms to documents that describe them in the incident review documents. Ask more people to draw diagrams. Visual representation can be really important and make it easier for people to read and understand. Have someone who is not involved in the event lead the analysis. Ryan Kitchens wrote this sort of blog post that I've linked to here. He says this: if the incident analyst participated in the incident, they will inevitably have a deeper understanding and bias towards the incident that will be impossible to remove in the process of analysis. If you were there, you're not necessarily going to investigate things that you are pretty sure you already know. Lastly, resist focusing on reducing the number of incidents. Ryan continues on. He says the cliche idea that we would do this work to reduce the number of incidents or to lessen the time to remediate is too simplistic. Of course, organizations want to have fewer incidents. However, stating this as an end goal actually hurts our organizations. Indeed, it will lead to a reduction in incident count, not from actually reducing the number of incidents, but rather lessening how and how often they are reported. I would add to what Ryan says here and say, instead, focus on increasing the number of people who want to read these reports and attend this post-incident review meetings. So that's the talk that I've got. I hope people have questions. I'm not entirely sure if they do, but that's that is the talk as it stands.
All right, I'm gonna come off mute. I was not expecting this. So let me see. I don't think there's any questions in the channels right now. So if anybody has questions right now, please share them. This would be a good time. I'm gonna ask my own questions for now. So one is, so I know you've been talking about this for a while now, right? But I still see a lot of people handling incidents in ways that are opposite of sort of the ideal way. Mm-hmm. And it seems that no matter how much we talk about it, it kind of doesn't trickle down. So is there something we can do?
That is a good question. I will be the first to say that that I would certainly, it would be more satisfying to have seen progress in the industry. I would say a couple of things. One is my guess is more organizations have much more leeway than they think they have. In some cases, there's nothing that says that or at least nothing that I've seen, sort of has a procedure for how to run a postmortem meeting on a minute by minute basis. There are still, as much as I'd like to rail on sort of constraining postmortem templates to fill out. Many of them have open text fields, right? Here's the thing: stories like I've described are happening. They're just not seen as the thing, right? There's an official bookkeeping sort of accounting, and you fill out the form, you do the thing, you say why, a certain number of times, the root cause, and all of that. I can say that I'm certainly not a fan of sort of declaring organization-wide that something new is different, and you're flipping from some world to another world. What we see more often is enthusiastic individuals inside the organization doing things just a little bit differently in addition to what they're already doing. Over time, people will be engaging with that extra stuff more so than the stuff that they had been previously doing, because what they're previously been doing is terrible. And you just have to give someone a post-incident review. I ask people all the time. We say, well, do you have postmortems? And they say, oh yes. So of course we never want a good crisis go to waste, and sort of insert some cliche there. And then I say, oh, that's excellent. I say, well, who reads them? And nobody has an answer for that. But I can tell you that what we hear is that nobody reads them because there's nothing, you can't get much out of it. It's easier to go to your colleague and say, what happened?
Interesting. So another question is, how do you convince upper management not to reduce number of incidents?
Oh, you probably can't. I mean, you probably can't. That's what I'm saying. Someone we know quite well has done such a very good job of continuing to provide the reports, the charts, the graphs that management has continually asked for. But what she's done is to add alongside it the sort of the deeper narrative of what was important, what was difficult, what was notable about a given incident. And over time, that they started looking more at that extra stuff, asking questions more about that, and less about, why isn't the number going down? And in that way, I'd say it's a little bit of subterfuge, a little bit of it's a little sneaky, but it's effective.
Another question is, do you have any recommendations for improving the quality of storytelling, right? So any references to read or something to learn from?
So yes. Here, incidents are palpable events. Engineers don't drop their memories. They don't drop their experiences of having been in the incident, trying to work out what's happening, what does it mean, what can we do. Asking engineers who were there about what was difficult. Ask them what stood out for them. Record that. Stick it in the. We've never found an engineer who is shy about telling us about what was hard and what was difficult. The question isn't about whether or not you can persuade somebody to give more detail, although that is. But if you can set up, it is a challenge to do that. If you can set up a situation where they're giving details about what it was like for them, and that you can demonstrate that you are going to keep those details in confidence. You may ask them if you could, if not perhaps quote them, but sort of paraphrase unattributed in an incident review. But the content generators are there, and you know that they're there because these are the stories that you hear after work. These are the stories that you hear during lunch. These are the stories that you hear over drinks. These are the stories that you hear in the hallways of conferences. Yes, so when we find engineers telling stories about interesting outages, every engineer in the room is quiet and wants to listen very carefully. So that I believe the power is there.
Another question is, how do you encourage or introduce incident review meetings to a new team? I'm a tester, so it's hard to influence or encourage them, but they're really helpful.
You mean having, I'm assuming that going from a world where they're either where they're not having a meeting, trying to convince them to have the meeting?
I'm assuming so too, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. If asking questions, you don't have to have a meeting to ask questions. And if you have some, if you don't have some way of gathering data from people, qualitative sort of, just reflections on what was hard, what was surprising, that sort of thing, then, if there's not a meeting, you can't convince somebody to have a meeting. You might be able to convince somebody to talk to you for 5 or 10 minutes at a time. What we have seen is somebody doing that, and then sort of synthesizing what they've heard into sort of a document, at which point later you can use that as we could have a meeting, we could experiment with it. Worst case is it's a terrible meeting, but I'm sure we already have terrible meetings and we can't get rid of them. So how about just trying one more and trying to make it a good meeting?
So I will sort of summarize, I think, a couple of questions because I have the same question. Is there like a framework for gathering this data, right? Because like there's good questions to ask and bad questions to ask, right? Jessica's going to be talking about how not to ask why questions.
Yes.
So if I'm new to this and I'm approaching this, I would like to know how to even structure this data gathering part.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you were to go, and I'll put the slides out there, and there are a number of talks that that I've given that I could sort of include links. The questions you ask are very important. They are a primary way that you can get really critical important information, and you certainly can do it poorly. What I would say is if you center your questions on what was difficult, what was straightforward, what was surprising, and what still sticks out for them as mysterious, you can't really go wrong. You'll hear more. The better answer is watch Jessica's talk. That's the better answer.
All right, so we're like slightly running out of time. So thank you so much for the awesome talk. And I know people can find you online and probably can find the slides online. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you. Thanks.